Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for our panel discussion. It is my great pleasure to share the stage with 5 excellent panelists with whom we will explore some of the most pressing questions about the Indo-Pacific as well as Western countries' engagement strategies within the Indo-Pacific in the rapidly evolving world order. I think few would deny the significance of the Indo-Pacific as well as the shift towards the East in terms of global economic and geopolitical significance. In fact, many scholars and decision makers are saying that we are living in the era of the Indo-Pacific. This mega region comprises 2/3 of the world's population, produces around 60% of its GDP, and accounts for at least half of its maritime transport. It is also the primary theater of the major power competition between the United States and China, and is an incredibly diverse region with plenty of middle powers. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that European countries as well as the European Union are seeking enhanced relations and engagement with this dynamically growing region, especially given the EU's own need to increase its sluggish productivity and lack of competitiveness. This is evidenced by the plethora of Indo-Pacific strategies being released by European countries. It is therefore highly timely to turn our attention to this dynamic region and discuss the West's engagement strategies in today's shifting world order. So without further ado, I would like to pose my first kind of warm-up question towards the distinguished panelists. What is the Indo-Pacific and why is this region producing the greatest economic growth in the world? And maybe start with Mr. Ugrosdi.
All right, you may very well ask the question that what a country with the size of the Hungarian Navy has to do with the Indo-Pacific. But obviously, this is one of the most dynamic regions that we see in the world today. It comes from a different approach to cooperation. It comes from a different approach to great power rivalry. And it also comes from a different outlook on the world. We just recently wrote a paper for the Prime Minister, and something I can share from that is that the overall outlook of the people in Europe and the people in the Indo-Pacific are very, very different when it comes to how they see the future. An overwhelming majority of the Europeans think that the future is much worse than we would anticipate. And only about 20% of Europeans would say that their kids will have better lives than they have. Whereas in the Indo-Pacific, it's completely the other way around. People are more optimistic. They're more optimistic about the future of their families, and they're more optimistic about the overall outlook of the world, which might come to you as a surprise. But if you look at the history of armed conflict, for example, in both regions, you will see that for a very long time, you had wars, proxy wars, civil wars, uprisings, and everything else in the Indo-Pacific, whereas Europe was a relative island of peace along the way. But now it seems to be the other way around, that you will see civil war, regular war, lots of other conflicts in Europe, whereas the ASEAN countries, for example, are much peaceful than they were like 50 years ago, which has a lot to do with the economic outlook, which has a lot to do with how people relate to life and their community. And I think this is part of the reasons that we have to listen more to the region. We have to get to know the region much better than we know it right now, and maybe take inspiration from that kind of an international setup, with all its problems, with all its flaws, with all the territorial disputes, notwithstanding what we see right now in the news every day. But yet there might be some points which could inspire the Europeans as well to give a second thought that how we're conducting our international relations in the long run.
Dr. Hakata, what do you think?
Yes. It is the emerging geography, I put it in this term, emerging geography that reflects the complex political realities of the vast region. The Indo-Pacific emerged when Japan's late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced the concept Conference of the Two Seas as early as 2007. And during the 2010s, the geographical concept fully emerged. And nowadays, in my classrooms, we often talk about the Indo-Pacific geography as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy. So it is taken as an accepted term. However, as all of us are all aware, this is a region of growth, but this is a region full of conflict potential and real. So we really have to manage the challenges inherent to this region. And Japan's perspective is that this region should be free and open. This is why Japan has come up with the notion of free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP. And it has been 9 years since the launch of this concept, and I think it has gained some attention and acceptance and understanding, but I believe that there are also some challenges and efforts to be made.
Thank you. Mr. Hawley, what is your perspective?
Thank you. Maybe from between all of the panelists up here, I bring a private sector business perspective to that definition of what the Indo-Pacific is. And I guess in the introduction, you talked about the concentration of maritime traffic moving through the Indo-Pacific. I think 50 to 60% of trade, shipping trade, goes through the region. So, I look at it as figuratively speaking, a blue river of energy. When you visit some of the nations that punctuate that kind of region, from India, where I'm from, far to the east in New Zealand, there are a number of countries which have very, very clearly articulated vision, and they've shown real progress against realising those visions. And through doing that, they're gaining a tremendous amount of momentum. And when you have momentum and you start achieving, aspects of those sort of visions that you articulate, it builds belief within society, within the companies that are operating in those regions. And the momentum from there becomes exponentially stronger and stronger. So again, going back to my sort of figurative lens on the region, it's full of energy, full of belief. And when then you also throw into that, companies looking to diversify supply chain into Vietnam and other nations, that's only adding, more confidence, more activity to the region. So I guess from a business point of view, notwithstanding the sensitivity around the different dynamics in the region, certainly a way of looking at it is that there's plenty of opportunity.
Thank you. Dr. Panda?
Thank you. I think the way I do see Indo-Pacific, it's an inclusive agenda setting zone with exclusive approach. I think if we talk about Indo-Pacific, it is evolving from time to time, and different nations have tried to perceive the region differently. But I think what is unique about Indo-Pacific is that it comes out with an inclusive agenda for global governance, which is central, particularly putting the maritime security as the top of the agenda. Second is that it is an exclusive zone in the context that it has two main characters into it. One is a active participation of countries, and particularly a country like India, which is the most populous and one of the fastest growing economy in the regions. On the other hand, you have the second largest populous country of the world, that is China, which is invisible, but still very actively, be there in the Indo-Pacific regions. So that's how I will look at the Indo-Pacific. But I think one of the most important thing for me, Indo-Pacific connotes is that it is a reactive region. It is a reactive region to the already established order that was prevailing for last 30 to 40 years, or 3 to 4 decades. So therefore, I would say that the Indo-Pacific so far has been developed as a reactive zone to the authoritarian rulemaking with an inclusive vision and with an exclusive agenda. And that's how Indo-Pacific is. One of the other aspect of Indo-Pacific which needs to be noted that I think most of the debate within Indo-Pacific has been lost between China versus the rest. Where we have not really seen Indo-Pacific as a zone where it is becoming a contesting zone between the rest versus the rest. where rest there are lesser ranked economies like ASEAN countries, which are central to the Indo-Pacific narrative. But at the same time, we have dominant economies in the regions, be it United States, be it Japan, be it including South Korea. And I think both South Korea and Japan are the two trading big economies in the regions, whereas we have populist economies, we have market economies in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a tough going on, there is a conflict going on among some of these economies, which should not be ignored. So therefore, there are new dynamics is emerging in the Indo-Pacific as it evolves from time to time, that it is also a region between rest versus rest.
Dr. Knight, how do you see this question?
So I guess I agree with the panelists in many ways. It's a very heterogeneous region in terms of the political systems, levels of economic development, and again, the challenges that I think the region faces. We often depict the Indo-Pacific as a very positive region with the most populous countries, China, India, and Indonesia, burgeoning middle classes. But we should also remember that the engines of economic growth, China, Japan, and Korea, are all aging. And it's a very, very serious problem, and it's having huge downward pressures on their economy. We should also be aware that Southeast Asia, although it's growing quickly, has many internal structural problems, which suggests that its future is not linear. And of course, we heard yesterday that India has a population dividend. Yes, it has 800 million young people under 30. But it doesn't have 800 million jobs for those people under 30. That means this region is actually very, very dynamic, and its development is not linear and not secure. And I think this is a really important take-home for us to be looking at. It has huge potential, but also huge challenges. Lastly, I think it's really important for us to be thinking about the Indo-Pacific broad trajectory. For the past 20, 30 years, we've seen China's rise. It went from one of the poorest countries on the planet to a relatively prosperous society. And it's used that economic power, sometimes coercively, to shape the behavior of other states. I think the broader strategic outlook or understanding of the Indo-Pacific really is to create a multipolar region based in the Indo-Pacific with India as a pole, ASEAN as a pole, Japan and the Korean Peninsula as a pole, perhaps Australia and the US as a pole, pulling the center of gravity away from China towards a multipolar region to prevent domination by one particular country. So again, it's heterogeneous, there's many challenges, but again, it's also a geopolitical project to ensure that the region develops stably and not dominated by one particular power.
Since we're on that topic, given that the Indo-Pacific is growing increasingly contested with the US-China geopolitical contestation going full swing, how will it impact the region, in your opinion? And what if the Indo-Pacific countries are being forced to choose sides? What do you think?
Well, I cannot speak for an Indo-Pacific country, so I'll give the outside view. What we picked up in the last couple of years, since we've been looking at the region quite intensively, is that most of the countries in the region base their decisions on their own national interests. They listen to their friends, but they reserve the right not to listen to their friends when their national interests supersede the interest of their friends. And this is why we see sometimes surprising setups of international meetings, like ASEAN +3, which took place quite recently. You had the 10 ASEAN countries, Korea, Japan, and China sitting around the same table. Whereas Korea and Japan, China and Korea, China and Japan, and so on and so forth, do have some major unsettled conflicts at the end of the day. But still, the need for cooperation, economic dividends, and also the idea and the urge to keep the stability of the region can supersede this kind of conflicts, which are obviously there, whether you call it the 9-line, 10-line, whatever. That doesn't mean that these countries are not talking to each other. And this is in stark contrast with what we have in Europe at the moment, where diplomacy is basically telling that who are the guys you're not talking to, despite having serious problems with the other side. And I think this is a lesson for all of us, at least in the continent which have claimed to invent diplomacy, even though that's not the case, that occasionally you have to talk to the other side, even and especially if you have unresolved issues with each other, because there's no other way around it. And I think the Indo-Pacific had to learn it the hard way that war is an extension of politics, but maybe not the most useful one. And if I look at the history of armed conflicts in the region for the last 150 years, I see suffering, I see hundreds of millions of dead, I see enormous devastation, countries being set back decades in their economic development. And even more importantly, this experience is not that far away. You had the colonial wars raging 80 years ago. You had all kinds of different interventions. The generations which are still alive know exactly well what war means for a society. And they are trying everything they can to avoid that happening again. And this doesn't mean that they don't have conflicts. It doesn't mean they don't have misunderstandings and diverging interests, but they can put this all in a perspective that what does it mean to go the other way, and what does it mean to fight it out, to be very blunt at the end.
Feel free to add anything.
Let me just jump in on that, because I think Martin really paints a really great picture. Because if we look at the region, for example, ASEAN countries and China, the bilateral trade is about $1 trillion US. $1 trillion US. So despite the security challenges, that $1 trillion US means they have a lot more to lose than they have to gain from conflict. If you look at Japan and China, about $380 billion of bilateral trade last year. The dirty secret is it's by and large equal. That means the Chinese need the Japanese as much as the Japanese need the Chinese. The biggest trading partner for South Korea is China. Australia is a very important trading partner for China's development. We still have huge trade in terms of iron ore materials going to the Chinese market. So these countries are very much codependent today. That may change in 10 or 20 years, but it's a region that has many security challenges, but the states in the region don't have a zero-sum approach to each other. They join the same free trade agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They use initiatives such as the BRI or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific to focus on development. We see this really interesting interaction where states aren't choosing, to your question, they're actually hedging. They're taking the benefits from the US, benefits from China, benefits from extra-regional countries like Japan, and of course, the EU is an important partner for the region, and that's exemplified by the Vietnam EU Free Trade Agreement and more free trade agreements in the works.
Dr. Hakata, how do you see the strategies of Indo-Pacific countries amidst tensions?
I think the prevailing trend for the majority of states in the Indo-Pacific is opt for the neutrality and the non-alignment. So we have a lot of Switzerland and probably Hungary's in our region. And despite the efforts to create the free and open Indo-Pacific and to counter China, these neutral countries as realities. And I have to admit that the Indo-Pacific strategies are in the stalemate, but this is a starting point. And we don't have too much expectation to bring these countries to our side. They prefer neutrality, and that's fine as it is. But the thing is that Japan and other Indo-Pacific partner countries have found a preferred pinpoint selected countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, or the Palau in the Southern Pacific. So we have some closer partner countries to have the coalition of the like-minded countries. So the whole picture is quite complex right now, but I think we have to advance little by little on the strategic side. And China still remains a big issue in this region. It is a dominant economic player, and of course the number one economic partner for Japan remains China. But in recent years, under the efforts of the Japanese government, there has been efforts to de-risk Chinese investments and also the Chinese economic coercions. So at the time when China tries to dominate the Indo-Pacific region, Japan and other like-minded countries are employing the efforts to curb the Chinese influence.
Mr. Hawley, what is your perspective from New Zealand?
I echo a lot of the comments made in answering that question. I sort of feel that all the countries, all the markets are codependent on each other and kind of closely intertwined. And one observation for me that, I think rather than answering the question around forcing anybody to make a choice, I think most of the countries in question instead view the region as a centre of opportunity, and that if that question ever did come up, it's hopefully in the distant future. Maybe the past 20 years or so, globalization, at least looking from a Indo-Pacific or South Pacific lens, has been characterized by a sino-asymmetric version of globalization, potentially as other countries work and build relationships and trade between each other. What we could be creating is a more genuine version of globalization, I think, where there's more reciprocity and more countries in the Indo-Pacific in particular, increasing that codependence and trade between each other, so that the issue or challenge that we sort of talk about on the panel here may over time decrease as mutual trust and trade gradually increases over the years ahead.
Dr. Panda?
I think one of the unique points for me in Indo-Pacific is that the strategic significance of the growth corridor. And I think if we talk about Indo-Pacific over the last 10 years or 8 years or so, I think one of the person who unified the entire region was the late Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. After him, we don't really see any leader really unifying the regions. But one of the unifying element in the Indo-Pacific has been that most of the economies in the regions, they are trying to see themselves as more from a autonomous point of view, in terms of not only having to look for a foreign policy which will provide them economic security, but also trying to also align more closely with the immediate and extended neighborhood. And therefore, we are seeing that the growth corridors of different sub-regions of Indo-Pacific are becoming much more important. If we talk, for example, if we talk about, Bay of Bengal region, last 10 years, a lot has happened there. Japan has come out as a bigger actor in terms of investment, even though, PM Abe is still not there. Then South Korea has come back to Bay of Bengal region. South Korea is investing in a bigger format in Indian market, domestic market. That is a huge change for, India to stay engaged with, beyond the ASEAN regions. Similarly, if we talk about ASEAN, from the other aspect, other side, EU has come to engage with the ASEAN in a bigger way. For example, Global Gateway has been the chain of contacts there. So each one of the sub-regions in Indo-Pacific has become much more important. The rise of the economy, the growth corridor are becoming the hallmark of the growth patterns of Indo-Pacific. The other aspect is that what we are seeing in Indo-Pacific, which is itself is a challenge, but also an opportunity, I do agree with all the speakers, is that even the Abe brought unity to Indo-Pacific. I think it was the American financial and military backing to the Indo-Pacific that did matter. And therefore, we had the successful Quad to many other multilateral, including with AUKUS. But what is also today we are watching with Trump 2.0, that there is a setback. There is a withdrawal approach. And so what we are seeing a transition in American approach from America first approach to a uni-America approach. And that is a huge setback for the regions, but at the same time, it is an opportunity for the Indo-Pacific countries because they are trying to think much more self-oriented, independent way, and more in an exclusive format from the region itself. And therefore, you will see that countries like India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, ASEAN countries, they are thinking more about their economic security as well as political security in the regions, minus United States of America. And I think these are the two critical developments in the Indo-Pacific, which will probably push it, keep on going. And these are bigger development for me in the region.
Do you have anything to add, Dr. Nagy?
This is such a, there's so many things to jump off on this topic, but As we look to the Indo-Pacific, one of the, again, those characteristics is it's very heterogeneous. And if you want to be an effective country to secure your national interests within the region, you can't just work with so-called like-minded countries. So you can't just work with democracies, or you have to work with socialist states, theocracies, developing states, developed states, soft authoritarian states. And this region does it pretty well. And in that sense, because we're talking in Budapest, and I just came from a Ukraine-Russian panel, I think we're not very good with that in this region. It's an us versus them. I think this morning's panel with John Mishimer and Balázs Orbán also touched upon this, is liberal doesn't necessarily mean good. So looking at countries like Japan, and Japan is really interesting. I call it an international adapter middle power. It's happy to connect Vietnam to the United States. It's happy to work with China and India. It's happy to work with Singapore. It's happy to work with the Philippines and Australia, the United States. So it works in different minilateral formats, and it's not so much about having shared political institutions, but shared national interests and trying to contribute to peace and stability and prosperity in the region. Perhaps that is a lesson to be learned in this part of the world, looking at how we can work with other kinds of institutions and kinds of governments, even though we may not share those political values.
If I can jump in on that, so I would agree in terms of there are lots of different organisations, governments, private sector, working with other customers or their counterparts with different governance structures for sure. But I also think that maybe one of the differences in terms of operating in that region is how you engage and what you engage with. So, we've certainly noticed working, locally where we are all the way out to India. In a previous kind of lifetime, we might have been looking at commercial deals in a transactive sense. We offer something to somebody, they buy it, and the deal's done. In its simplest terms, it was a deal, but actually, most of the initiatives that are underway right now are more long-term partnerships. So the horizon through which you're judging these partnerships with other organisations and other nations are kind of measured in sort of multi-decade timelines rather than an immediate extractive sense of return straight away. So I guess that would be my contribution there, is that the kind of deal cycle and the horizon through which you look or assess those through is far longer than maybe you might expect in a purely kind of Western point of view. And the other contribution to that point, I would say, is that traditionally, again, for us, we might be selling something to a market, but we'd traditionally be looking at how do we own the implementation of that solution in that local market? How do we control it? And that's sort of the paradigm through which historically we've looked at commercial deals, but increasingly that's not the way to go about operating in that region at all today. It's more around, again, that sense of partnership. So how do you become very deliberate about what you frame up as something of value, but leave space for the reciprocal country and the other nation to add value and own part of that value chain as it gets localized, which is quite different. So, when you step back from sort of command and control every single element of how that product, service or capability comes to life in another country in the Indo-Pacific, it's more around what have we got, how can someone add value to that? And so that you end up with a kind of win-win reciprocal dynamic that's operating, which I don't know is true everywhere in the world.
Let us move on to European strategies regarding the Indo-Pacific. Given that nothing is as far away from Europe as this region, it is shielded by two seas. How can we meaningfully engage with a region so far away?
I think it goes back to the conversation that Professor Mearsheimer had on the stage earlier today, that whether we want to see the world as the good guys and the bad guys, or whether we are more pragmatic based on the national interest and are seeing a more colorful world out there. And as Stephen outlined, the Indo-Pacific is a very heterogeneous region. I think it's also contested that where does it start? Does it start with India or does it start with South Africa? And whether it ends with Japan or whether it goes up to Kamchatka and includes Russia as well. Not to mention the other side of the Pacific, like the Americas, down to Chile. So it's impossible to have a unified view of this region because it's so complicated, it's so vast, it's like more than half of the world, even more than if I look at the world's GDP and the population. So I think we have to be realistic as Europeans when it comes to engaging the region. We have to base our assumptions and strategies and policies on reality instead of wishful thinking. And to be honest, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy of the European Union, which was published a few years ago. And if you look at how it relates to China, I mean, you will remain perplexed because a country cannot be a partner and a strategic competitor at the same time. Or it can, but then you're not supposed to write about it because you cannot simplify it to a level that you can put it in a strategic document. And you see this ambiguity on the European level. And it seems to me that the European Indo-Pacific strategy is basically a relabeling of the European China strategy at the end of the day. And what worries me a little bit is that Europe tends to look at the region through the very simplifying lens of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And the European-China policy is driven by how China is behaving in the Russian-Ukrainian war. We're trying to convince our partners all around the world that the war in Ukraine is the most important thing that is happening today, and you have to pick sides. And seriously, most of these countries don't even want to pick sides between the epic fight between the China and the US. So why they would pick a side in the war between Ukraine and Russia in the long run? So I think Europe has to become more realistic. It has to be more aware of what is it capable of doing. And with all the respect, I hope we don't have anybody from the German embassy sitting in the audience, but it was really entertaining when the German Foreign Ministry said that they're going to send the German Navy to conduct a freedom of navigation operation on the Taiwan Strait. I mean, yeah, but do you have a ship which can actually sail there and then come back? And how you're going to support it, how you're going to fuel it, and all those tiny insignificant details that make a blue water navy, which is a major source of power projection. So Europe barks really loud, but it cannot really bite. And I think most of our partners, especially in the region, are fully aware of this. And that basically questions the seriousness of European policies towards the region to a large extent, which is not beneficial for us, it's not beneficial for the region, but it's really politicized at the end of the day, and because of that, it's really hard to have a real conversation on these issues, unfortunately.
Anything to add?
It's a great question. So I get 4 areas. I think trade, development, infrastructure connectivity, and peace and stability. I think those are the 4 areas that we want to be thinking about from Europe's perspective. In terms of trade, you don't need a region-wide trade agreement. You can have bilateral trade agreements. Again, the Vietnam EU FTA is a good example. The Japan EU economic partnership is a good example. You don't have to have a region-wide approach, but you build hubs of prosperity and engagement, and then that spreads through the region. 2, in terms of development, the Indo-Pacific countries don't want you to come in and talk about democracy, human rights, or identity politics. But if you talk about development and good governance and getting rid of corruption, you know what? You're going to have a different kind of response. So it's the language of the region is really important. Infrastructure and connectivity, again, are really important. The reality is the levels of development in the region go from Singapore, and Japan and South Korea and parts of China, which are extremely developed, to Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar and the Philippines that have no infrastructure or very little. So that is an area where you can contribute, and it doesn't have to be just in terms of nuts and bolts and bridges. It could be through provision of training engineers. There's a lot of creative ways. Last, peace and stability. This is actually really important to articulate to Europeans why the region matters. About 5.5 trillion US dollars of trade goes through the South China Sea every year. If there is conflict in the South China Sea, it affects every part of the world. If there's a conflict across the Taiwan Strait, most estimates between 7 and 10% of global GDP, so 10 to 15 trillion US dollars of global GDP will disappear. That will make the Russian conflict actually look pretty small. So when we are articulating why we focus and want to invest in peace and peace and stability in the region, we understand, or we should convey to our citizens, that the region matters for Europe's prosperity. The region matters for prosperity. The region matters for Europe's ability to compete and be, whether we want to call it a geopolitical power or a power that does provide public goods to the world. So I think those are 4 areas that we could build on in terms of a strong Indo-Pacific engagement.
Yeah, I think there are some areas where we have to look at very closely whether Europe is really looking at Indo-Pacific as a future area of, a future zone of cooperation or not. I think I'll start with this Ukraine war. I think what Ukraine war has done is that it has exposed the problem areas to the forefront in European community. One is that probably they don't have really that kind of security mandate to look at their future at this moment. And therefore, EU would really like to have its own doctrine of security, own type of defense autonomy, defense and security autonomy in times to come. And this is one area where Indo-Pacific is going to benefit Europe massively. If we talk about the countries in the Indo-Pacific regions, they are going to have intense and serious collaborations with some of the European countries, if not all. I could just cite 2 examples. I mean, already it's happening between France and India. And if we talk about, more countries, probably, Sweden is one of those countries which might emerge as a strong defense partner. So there are security and defense areas where there are bound to collaboration between EU and Indo-Pacific countries are going to happen. The second area where I could see is that, this COVID pandemic dynamics, and then you have the Ukraine war, which has also exposed the supply chain vulnerability. So that also allows us to think about how energy and renewable energy could be one of the good area of collaborations between Europe and Indo-Pacific countries. And there India comes into the forefront as a leading partner for EU. If you talk about renewable energy, probably most of the countries in EU would like to collaborate with India. Then you have a kind of area called skill setups, skill industrial setups, where not only India but some of the ASEAN countries also fits into EU's mandate. When it comes to collaborations in science and technology, that is another huge area which opens a lot of opportunities for EU countries. So there are 3-4 areas: science and technology, defense, security, renewable energy, and including connectivity and investment. And I think these are the areas which will make EU to become a much more natural partner in times to come. And I think we must draw from the Ukraine war and from the pandemic. And I think EU has already taken a strong note about that. So this collaboration is going to only be bigger from now on.
Dr. Steven, you said you wanted to ask.
I just wanted, I think these are really great proposals. But another area has to do with climate change and the environment. And the reality is the Pacific Islands, much of Southeast Asia, much of Bangladesh and India are going to be dramatically affected by climate change in a negative way. And there will be refugees, and this will be highly destabilizing to the region's economies, to the existence of many countries. And at the end of the day, I think it will be more developed states that will have to ultimately, pardon my expression, clean up the mess. And this will be a security challenge where millions of refugees are moving between countries to escape climate change. This will disrupt economies. It will be highly, highly destabilizing. We should get ahead of these challenges, and we need to work with all stakeholders in the region. And this is probably one of the challenges with the framing of the Indo-Pacific. We don't include China in this. And I know I understand why the Indo-Pacific is, again, been made to pull the center of gravity away from China, but we need China to solve many of these issues. And that means using their resources, finding crosswalks. And again, these are great ways to de-escalate some of tensions in other areas. So as Europe is thinking about it, maybe they can, to borrow the connectivity phrase, is maybe they can connect some of the Indo-Pacific countries with China to put forward some realistic environmental solutions, not the extreme environmental regulation that we see in Europe now, but rather to deal with some of the challenges in the region that are really existential. And I think it's an area that, again, Europe can think about.
Dr. Hakata, how do you see the EU's engagement in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, yes, of course. EU has published its Indo-Pacific strategic document back in 2021. But what we see is the diverging strategic priorities of each 27 member country. So we have to deal individually and bilaterally with some countries who are most interested in this region. And I think we now have the good picture of who are truly interested in this region. And I think landlocked country like Czech Republic is one of them, and Lithuania, which is located in the Baltic region, is another one. So Japan has in recent years concluded a strategic partnership, and they're reinforcing the defense cooperation. So it's beautiful to see the EU as a whole interested with the document. However, the strategic interests vary from one country to another. So we have to deal individually with the some selected countries. So again, like in the other region in the Indo-Pacific, we have to deal bilaterally. And in the past, we have the multilaterals which are booming, but the real picture is that we have to deal on the bilateral basis, including with European countries.
Mr. Hooley, given your background, which industries, business tactics seem to be most promising?
Well, I guess firstly, being from New Zealand, and if I can speak for our brothers and sisters in Australia, we are two global north nations sitting at the very end of the global south. So I think hearing the conversation, people are talking about the Indo-Pacific as being a sort of a distant other thing, but the two nations there in particular are kind of Western for one. So I guess there's an opportunity to consider those two nations as a conduit to some of the countries, particular in the kind of the southern end of the Indo-Pacific as well, where Australia and New Zealand are already working with other nations on the sort of climate infrastructure front as well, which is a very real problem. Getting more real as the years progress. Stephen was talking about. I think for me, engaging in the area, I touched on it before, so there's the kind of soft skills in terms of how companies are engaging in the area. It's very different from other parts of the world. And then it's sort of figuring out, what to offer, not in an extractive sense, but how can you offer that so that those countries and those markets that you're going into can add value and gain and localize that and have some control of that so that the relationship that you're building is sustainable and long-term rather than a sort of one-hit revenue gain and then leave. I think from a New Zealand point of view, we've long been looking at that in particular, if you like, from a Western country sitting in the middle of the South Pacific. And for many, many years, we've done reasonably well trading commodities based on the strength and the fertile nature of our soil and the plentiful rainfall and whatever else kind of makes things grow. And cows and sheep do their thing day in, day out, which has proven to be very, very successful. But then there's a natural cap on that. There's a number of pressures, right? There's the making sure that we can kind of look after the ecosystem that we've got and looking ahead at the implications of climate change, but also many of our partners in that region are starting to say, no, we don't want any more commodities. We can kind of do some of that ourselves. Let's talk about the smart version of that. So when we're looking at India or other countries in the region, instead of shipping apples, which we may have done the past few decades, the conversation is more around how we license smart seeds or co-create varietals that can germinate in those different countries across the Indo-Pacific, which is just far different from what we're doing. So I think New Zealand 2.0 is much more around, creating specific value that others can create value on top of, rather than what we've been doing in the past. So I guess for European nations or other Western nations looking at the area, for me, rather than selling to them, create something that they can add to, so that you can the value that's gained out of that is reciprocal. And I think in some ways, when we talk about working together to solve some of the issues around climate change and some of the benefits around diffusing some of the tensions in that area, one of the benefits from co-creating value or creating reciprocal value between the regions, whether they're countries within the region, country to country, or European countries looking in, when you have multiple strong sustainable relationships where there's mutual trust and transparency, even if those countries or companies have a different view of the world, but you agree that 60 or 70% of is enough in terms of what you have in common. That I think helps strengthen relationships. It keeps things kind of pragmatic and helps diffuse, any tensions that may be there. So I think the more we can kind of not only tackle the problems that we talk about, but increasingly deliberately go around creating a trade kind of dynamic in that way, that's only going to be better in terms of keeping things calm, productive, and fair. And I think that last point for me, for the last 20 years, there's definitely been wealth created and value gained, but it's been somewhat asymmetric. I think when you look at the depth of technical prowess and knowledge and capability that's emerging in Vietnam and other nations, when you look at the trajectory and the acceleration of those different nations, there's every opportunity for that value to be shared and for people to participate in improving products as they move through markets, which is not only going to make supply chains more resilient, but again, going back to the other point, we become far more integrated. So the old version of what we thought of as globalization, where actually only one or two nations reaped most of the benefits, I think because everyone's maturing in that area at such a pace, there's a real chance to integrate more deeply. And so maybe in the next sort of 10 years, when you have integrated supply chains of people adding value across the Indo-Pacific, we become, I'm not going to say the kind of same, but deeply integrated, so that those counter forces are diluted or diffused.
We have time for one more question. And given that this is the Budapest Global Dialogue, I'm interested in your opinion whether a country like Hungary can actually reach the markets of the Indo-Pacific, because we have made some good progress in attracting investment from Indo-Pacific countries, but can we turn this around and reach the markets? Do we have any chance in that, and how, if so?
Well, it really comes down to size. And the problem with that is that we're a small market and there's a limited amount of things that we can produce. There are two ways around this problem. First, either you specialize on certain niche markets, like, high-end wine, semiconductors, AI, whatever, depending on the individual strength of all these countries, Hungary included, or you try to integrate into global value chains, feeding into those value chains, sorry for repeating it again, that Andrew was just talking about, that how you can build a global network, how you can upscale companies, where you can play an important role in that kind of a global cooperation that used to shape the world economy for the last 35 years. I think our approach is clear. It's quite obvious that not a lot of parts of the world will see economic growth for the years to come, and the Indo-Pacific is one of these. So, like it or not, we have to find out how we're going to engage these countries. And we've been doing that. The Hungarian government has been doing that for more than 12 years now with the policy of the Eastern Opening. And the Eastern Opening policy is often being conflated with our political engagement of Russia before the war in Ukraine, and then China starting in the mid-2010s. but it's also Korea, it's also Japan, it's also Singapore, it's also India, it's also a bunch of other countries which are not on our radar yet. But I mean, we've been receiving the leadership of Vietnam quite recently in the last couple of years. Nobody really took notice of that because Vietnam is not China. We'd had high-level engagements with Japan. The president of Hungary has just been to Japan to participate in the expo in Osaka. So you have all these kind of high-level engagements. Out of the last 6 years, South Korea has been the largest foreign direct investor in Hungary. But every time it makes it to the press is the other 3 years when it was China. So if you discount the political noise around all this, you see lots of progress, but the fundamental question remains that what we can produce for these markets. Can you produce it in a volume that makes a difference in those markets? And just to give you a very mundane example, because we have two great experts from Japan taking part, who knows about Hungarian pork entering the Japanese market? You do, because you do have some ties to Hungary, but this has been one of the most important agricultural success stories we had in the last 10 years. That one Hungarian company specializing in exporting a few thousand tons of pork to Japan made a success story, and you can literally buy, not in the 7-Elevens, but maybe in the high-end Tokyo restaurant, some Hungarian pork. And Tokyo is famous for the tens of thousands of restaurants it has, so you will not stumble upon Hungarian pork in every one of them. But maybe if you will find it in 20, and those are high standard restaurants, and all of us can make a lot of money out of that. Hungarian companies selling pork to Japan and Japanese restaurants selling Hungarian pork to high-end customers. This can be a way to go. But it's not like that we start to export grain or grape or wine to China indefinitely. First of all, because we don't have indefinite amounts of these products. And second, this is not how the market works. Maybe it was true in the times of the Soviet Union, when we could literally dump anything on the Soviet market, but those times are over. You have to be good. You have to be really good to be able to compete internationally today.
So the good news was, to my big surprise, near my apartment, I found a bottle of Palinka, Tokai wine, Debreceni sausages from my father's hometown in Debrecen, and some Hungarian turkey. So it is penetrating the market, but again, it's small. So I think there's two strategies here when we're thinking about it from the perspective of Hungary. Of course, you need to develop your soft power and a Hungarian brand. What is Hungary? What is the food? What is the drink? What is the comparative advantage products that are produced here? And the government needs to sell that. But ultimately, it's businesses. Businesses form business-to-business partnerships. They secure the market. They understand the local market. And that, I think, these have to go hand in hand. But the government can help. Again, producing that Hungarian image. And whether it's in Japan or China or South Korea or Southeast Asia, there's little Hungarian soft power. So I think that is something that you could do a lot more. And things like Expo that's going on in Japan right now is a great example. But these should be used as opportunities to develop Hungarian soft power, to open the minds of consumers. Second, I think it's important to work with regional associations like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So you have a bilateral approach, and then you have a multilateral approach. And this brings out the tension that we had this morning in terms of hardcore regionalism versus liberalism. It's actually, you can't choose between the two. You have to, on different issues, you have to find different solutions. So work with the different associations, find ways to fill gaps. But again, that takes a government side, and it takes the private sector side working together.
Dr. Panda?
Yeah, I think if I have to think a little from Hungarian point of view, for last 2 decades or so, Hungary has been having a much more China-focused strategy. And I think time has come to deviate a little from that China-focused strategy, to look at 2-3 economies in the regions who could be tremendously beneficial for Hungary. That is India, Japan, and ASEAN market. And I think these are the 3 places where there has to be a greater focus from Hungary side. It cannot only have a China-focused strategy when it comes to Asia. The second is that I think one of the drawbacks that I do see, of course, there is a lot of collaboration has already happened traditionally. But I think we have to also understand in the current context of the engagement that is happening between the mainstream European community and Indo-Pacific communities, particularly in the areas of education and knowledge distribution, knowledge sharing. This is where Hungary could be gaining a lot, and vice versa. I think we need to have much more educational linkages between Hungary, universities, and think tank level. That will create a necessary awareness about preparing a roadmap for the next 1 decade. The other aspect, I think this is also necessary. We do talk about a lot about economic growth, investment, and other things, but one area which could be also a critical area for engagement in times to come is agricultural sector. Today, probably we are moving to AI age, and we are increasingly talking about cyber technologies to AI technologies to all sort of technologies. But then we don't really talk about how to revitalize the agricultural sectors as a medium of collaborations. And this is where I think one of the lesson we draw from the Nordic countries. There is no compromise when it comes to agricultural sector or land or climate or the environmental aspects. So this could be one good way of establishing this connect between Hungary and mainstream Indo-Pacific communities, particularly with India, putting agriculture as a medium of collaboration.
Mr. Holy, any free consulting advice for Hungary?
I just want to build on Stephen's two points, the storytelling or the story of Hungary. And I completely agree. New Zealand, although probably half the size, we're still kind of both reasonably small nations. I think in about 2008, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs aligned our tourism, international education, immigration, and our export sector around a centralised storytelling strategy that would not only sort of permeate foreign affairs, but also pretty much every brand and commodity that left New Zealand. And it was pretty important because in a nation of 5 million people, it's very difficult to compete and buy a share of voice in international markets, but especially markets across the Indo-Pacific, which are huge. So the only way to really do that was to have a consolidated voice. At the same time, we've sort of, I guess not directly, but have managed to use the film industry as a way to perpetuate the mythology or the story around New Zealand and the natural landscape and the food and things that kind of go around that. But I'd say the storytelling as part of the soft power is super powerful. So being able to kind of leverage and mobilise that is key. And the other piece, I did notice that New Zealand doesn't really activate its diaspora that effectively. I think we've got 14% of our nation living offshore. And they need to be activated in a sort of a hyper competitive kind of commercial environment that we're in. But Hungary too has a significant diaspora as well. So I think once they know what story to tell, they could be incredibly useful. But I do also feel looking at Hungary, there's definitely a vision, a consolidated vision that everyone seems to understand, which is further ahead than some nations where for our own part, I think there's still argument over what it is we stand for and where we're heading. So now just making that into a compelling story is probably the easy part.
Dr. Hakata, any quick closing remarks?
Yes, Hungary has indeed a soft power. I used to live in Budapest 3 years ago, and my wife joined me. And the first thing she said is, I want to visit the house of Bartók. And I think that music is a asset that Hungary indeed has. But also you have nice wine and also the margaritza pork. Unfortunately, margaritza pork was impacted by the swine flu a couple of years ago. So the importation is prohibited in Japan. And I hope to see margaritza pork again introduced into the Japanese market. And I think it's important for Hungary to emulate such a success stories going beyond the margaritza pork. And I believe that Hungary's agricultural product and food products have the comparative advantages in the Indo-Pacific, we have Chile and we have the Australia and New Zealand. Competitors are very strong foothold, but I do believe that Hungary has still comparative advantages.
Well, I'm afraid that this is it for our conversation. We are still within the margin of error regarding our time, so well done us. Thank you very much for our distinguished panelists. This was a very excellent discussion, and thank you so much for the audience as well.